Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this very special and final event of the DPU 70th anniversary. Throughout this year, 2024, we have celebrated 70 years of Development Planning Unit through various events and conversations with colleagues and partners from different parts of the world. The title of this final event is Shaping Pathways to Urban Equality, Planning Methodologies for Collective Strategic Action. This event not only celebrates 70 years of the Development Planning Unit, but also serves as a perfect occasion for all of us at the DPU to acknowledge and celebrate the remarkable work and legacy of Professor Caren Levy, who played a pivotal role in shaping the DPU into what it is today. My name is Azadeh Mashayekhi, and I'm a lecturer at the Development Planning Unit, and I will be chairing this event tonight. We have a panel of 8 wonderful speakers, whom I will introduce shortly. But before inviting our panelists here, I will say a few words about the overall format of the event, the panel discussion, and briefly introduce Professor Caren Levy, who doesn't need any introduction for anybody, but only for those of you who don't know her, especially our students who just arrived at the DPU a few months ago at the beginning of this academic year. Many of you know and worked with Caren over the years. She has been a mentor, friend, and inspiration to many of us at the DPU and beyond. Professor Caren Levy joined the DPU in 1986, and one of her first roles was to co-lead a course with Caroline Moser called Planning with Women for Development. Just a year later, she renamed it to Gender Planning and Policy, and it continues today as a key component of the gender policy and planning program at the DPU. The list of her contributions, achievements, and leadership roles is extensive. Among other accomplishments, in 2005, she was appointed director of the DPU, becoming the first woman to hold this position. In 2012, she became the Bartlett Vice Dean of International, and in 2018, she was awarded by ESRC the Global Challenges Research Fund to lead an international hub of knowledge in action for urban equality, working with researchers and partners across 13 institutions in 9 cities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Throughout her career and her leadership roles at the DPU, she has pushed the boundaries of planning theory and practice, both professionally and institutionally. She has forged numerous local and international collaborations, supporting and working with various urban institutions, local, national, and international development agencies, and community-driven initiatives. Over the past few decades, she has enabled and helped build the capacities and sensibilities of many generations of practitioners and scholars to become agents of change and advance more just forms of urbanization and gender equality. Tonight, in this short event, we will not be able to provide a comprehensive picture of Caren's work as a whole, nor all of her contributions to the field of development planning. Instead, we have identified 4 themes that we feel encapsulate some of the key concerns in Caren's work and her various collaborations with different institutions and communities across the world. We will use these key themes to structure today's conversation, with 2 speakers on each theme reflecting on their own experiences and the impactful work they have done together with Caren. These themes are gender justice and urban equality across and within multiple organizations and sectors, collective strategic action planning in partnership with equivalence with and between communities, the public and private sectors, operationalizing transport justice and urban equality that challenges the foundations of traditional transport planning. And finally, Caren's innovative and alternative approach towards transdisciplinary co-learning and knowledge co-production in planning higher education, capacity building, and applied research. I'm going to introduce each of these speakers, like a couple, 2 speakers that are coming for each of these teams to speak. I think it's better that I introduce you for each team separately. So the first group of speakers is Professor Julian Walker, who is our director at the Development Planning Unit, and Claudie Hu, gender expert at L'Atre Égale, who is a close friend and ally of Caren for many years, fighting many battles for gender justice in planning and development. Please, I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh my God, the web is not complete. This is a disaster. Oh my God. That's out. It's fine. Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm so honored to be included in the team of those called to celebrate Caren's work. So Julian, Mr. Director, and I have been assigned to talk about the web of institutionalization, which is obviously a central piece in Caren's work, maybe a masterpiece in Caren's work. Caren published the web in 1996. So for those of you who do not know the web, there may still be a few people who don't know the web, it came out as 13 interconnected elements. So there's and 4 spheres. Well, and these elements and spheres, of course, represented at the same time spots for analysis and spots for action. So as a new user of the web, I started using the web with Caren in 1997, so it was, quite new. So I had to learn to draw the lines and produce the triangles, and she'd go mental if the triangles or the lines, were not properly done. So just to make sure that we give her a little bit of a heartbeat tonight, we have actually put together a series of best of the webs, like very funny webs, just to show that there's still people trying to get it right, but I haven't got it quite right. So we're going to be showing them in the background as we go ahead. The web came out in 1996, so that's just a year after Beijing, the 4th World Conference, Women World Conference in Beijing. At the time when gender mainstreaming was declared, a proper pathway to gender justice. And so, in many ways, as we are going towards celebrating 30 years of the platform of action, it's nice to really remember that basically what Caren produced in 1996 is as relevant today as it was then, and maybe even more relevant today as it was then. So there was really kind of a vision, and I'm just going to mention 4 points of that vision. Yeah, this one is quite interesting. I have left the names, at the bottom. You can go and complain to whoever. Well, we had less technology to produce proper triangles at the time, on our computers. So, very relevant for. I'm just going to mention four points. First of all, Caren, when she was introducing the web, was always referring to those 13 elements as sites of power. And I think 30 years later, having worked on gender, we know that achieving gender justice is a phenomenal battle. So definitely these are sites of power. That's absolutely true. Another point I wanted to mention, because that's very relevant to what I'm doing, is that Caren introduced budget, resources and budget in the web, right up there, at the time when gender-responsive budgeting was hardly talked about. And that has obviously become now a major issue the UN just declared gender-responsive budgeting as one of the 10 accelerators that are going to be helping towards achieving SDG 5 by 2030. The third point I wanted to mention is that from the start, it was all about the diversity of women and men. And so the intersectional approach was already there, which, as we know now, is absolutely essential to any work on gender justice. And the fourth point is about alliance building. It's an intrinsic aspect of the web, quite obviously. But what was really interesting always is to make sure that everybody understood that whoever you are, wherever you are, you can stand somewhere and do something to make that web, a more, well, maybe not that one. So as a practitioner and as an activist, I have shared the web in many different languages, many different contexts, on different sectors. I have had people telling me it was complex, it was difficult, but I never had anybody telling me it was not relevant. And I think that's a very important point. It has never failed to generate debates, to generate questions, and to generate collective ideas to move forward. There are still many holes in the webs, wherever we are, and we know that there are very conservative forces at the moment in all corners of the web that are busy trying to mess up the lines and the triangles, because gender justice is an unbearable vision of the future for these people. It's obviously not an unbearable vision for me or for you. So I would just like to say that we keep gender awake and we keep on weaving the web. Thank you, Karen.
Claude is taking my microphone away. Thank you. So thanks, Claudie. So Claudie and I have had a long experience of working with Caren and others who are here today as sort of foot soldiers of the web, from the development of this tool up to today when it's been used across a whole range of institutions. And talking today, I wanted to reflect a bit on the web, not so much as a methodology that was developed by Caren, but as a methodology that could only have been developed by Caren, because it relates so much to characteristics of who she is personally and professionally. And there's three things I wanted to reflect on. So the first is that Caren is a planner who very deliberately works at the interface between practice and theory. So she's a reflective planner, but she works very much in practice. Secondly, she's committed to a model of planning that's collaborative, not technocratic. So a model of planning that's working with others. And thirdly, that her planning is always structured by a focus on equality. So there's always a normative purpose behind her planning. So thinking about that and how that led to the web as it is, in terms of the first one, Caren's position between theory and practice, I was thinking back to when Claudie said Caren developed the web in the 90s. And for me, there were some really dominant themes, both in practice of planning and in academia around planning, that I think really Caren positioned herself in relation to. So actually, if you think about the development sector in practice then, including the promotion of gender equality, it was very much a trend at the time of working on best practices and toolkits, underpinned by the idea that there was a standard model for furthering these objectives, and that could be replicated across different contexts. On the other hand, in academia, I feel that this was a period in which post-structuralist thinking was very dominant, and actually that was quite the opposite thinking, and it rejected grand theories and the ideas of structures that were widely reproduced, and said you need to find processes and inequalities always in particular circumstances and histories. So I think this led to a danger on the one hand at the extreme of having action without reflection, and at the other extreme of having reflection that didn't always lead to action. And I feel that the web was a deliberate point of Caren as between theory and practice of thinking, how can we reconcile these tendencies? And as such, the web, I was going to say, maybe not this web, so her web is very much thinking about how we can have a structure which brings up general institutional practices and norms that we can see across all contexts, but use that as a tool to look at the specific relationships and realities and power structures in a given context. So trying to reconcile that. In terms of the second point about Caren being very much a planner focused on collaboration, Claudia already talked about this a bit in terms of alliances, but I think also, if you think, still today, but particularly in the 90s, working on gender equality in some of the institutions we were working with, so some of the big international development institutions, was a very lonely place for people. We often worked with people who felt very isolated and quite desperate in working on this. And actually, I think the web very much reflects Caren's focus on collaboration because it created a space for people to identify across this range of sites who they could be having alliances with, and also as a way of having a conversation between people in very different positions about their perspectives on this end. So I felt that was also very reflexive of Caren's approach. And the final point I made about Caren's sort of professional and personal orientation is her very strong focus on normative values around equality. And I think the sort of final thing I'd like to say about the web is, as a tool, it doesn't really do anything. It's meaningless unless you approach it with a normative value to unpack it. Otherwise, it becomes meaningless. And I think the web, those of us who have worked with it, you realise you can only use it towards a normative end. So the way it's identified is around diagnosis, around understanding the situation, and around developing routes or strategies. And without having some normative goal in mind, this becomes a completely afunctional tool. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to reflect a bit on how the web very much reflects on Caren's position. It's quite weird saying this in front of her, and she's probably disagreeing with everything, but I'm not going to make eye contact with her, and I'll hand back to Azza.
Thank you. So, oh yeah, the other two speakers are squished at the back of that row. So, for the second theme of strategic action planning, we will have Tim Wixon, lecturer at the Development Planning Unit, and Alex Ferediani from International Principal Researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIHS. Please.
Does that work? Yeah? Does that work? Great. Firstly, I just want to say I didn't realise we were supposed to be funny, so I went more earnest. But we'll see what we can see what we do with this. So just put that on the table. So again, continuing with tonight's theme of paired inputs. Obviously, I'm very happy to be spending time on the stage here with Alex, who's a sort of insider-outsider at the DPU. Right? He has been at the DPU for a long time. He's now just recently hopped over to IIED. And also on tonight's theme, it's also, I guess, fitting for tonight. We've also been given a very chunky, practical and intellectual contribution to speak to, and we've only been given 5 to 10 minutes. So, with that caveat on the table, and knowing that Caren usually unpacks this very beautiful diagram over 9 teaching weeks, we'll do our best, but we'll see how we go with it. Exactly. So yeah, strategic action planning. What is it? And no, I didn't want to jump to that. That was my punchline. Okay, so strategic action planning, Caren style. What is it? And what does it do for us as development planners, teachers, researchers, and practitioners? So for me, strategic action planning really is this, in this beautiful diagram, as you can see here, is part of the fabric of the DPU. What we are at the DPU, what we plan to do. But it's also a sort of key into the DPU's history. It's both a way of analysing and thinking about planning or planned interventions, and it's also an approach to acting differently in the city in order to build collectively towards more just and equitable futures. So it's really sort of, for me, a DPU framework for planning otherwise. Far from this sort of dusty or abstract theoretical approach, strategic action planning is best understood, at least in part, as this muddy translation or interpretation of Caren's long-standing and collective involvement with progressive alliances walking the talk of just urban transformations. In particular, her work here draws upon long-standing partnerships, I'm shaking, I'm getting nervous tonight, with international network of organisations, organisers, activists, planners, practitioners, some of whom are here in the room, some may be online. Many of these were at one point connected to or connected in with Homeless International's community-led infrastructure finance facility, the CLIF programme. We're glad to have Ruth in the room with us here. But others, it also reflects the work that Caren has done with Sumsuk Bunyabansha and the wider Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, ACHR. To the latter, although Sumsuk can't be with us here tonight, she did want to be part of proceedings, and maybe this is where my speech gets a bit funnier, because Sumsuk has given me something to read, and we'll bring this to the room now. So, this is what Sumsuk writes. As a person who works on actual changes, on action by the people to solve housing and poverty issues in Thailand and Asia, I never imagined that I could communicate very well the important depth of this work with academics. I always felt little gaps of understanding, but through sharing my actual work experience and thoughts with Caren, at some point it helped me understand aspects of my work better. We are two professionals, this is Sumsuk still speaking, of different work experiences, but we have always been able to share our work and thoughts. Sometimes, and here I'm going to add some things often, with new emerging conclusions. Again, Sumsuk, I'm highly inspired by Caren as a dedicated and highly energetic teacher, doing her best she can to give knowledge and help change and transform her students. Her immense energy touched and inspired me, and it is why we are similar, since I also have an inspiration and passion to help community people change for the better through the development process. And to close, in sort of inimitable Sumsuk style, but I'll do my best, she writes, I think Caren may not have a very peaceful retirement. Being such a veteran in the field for so long, her words, not mine, and by being so well known to key people, for Caren, retiring could well just become another interesting chapter of practice in an already interesting life. I, Sumsuk this is, look forward to seeing what will be next from her and hope we can still find opportunities to meet, to work together at points, and have some chances in the future. So reading between the lines there, Caren, I think Sumsuk's got a job for you. All right, back to strategic action planning, and aware that time is running. As well as honouring the knowledge and experience of these long-standing practice-based partnerships, Caren's thinking and writing on strategic action planning can also be seen as drawing together, evolving, expanding, and inspiring connected contributions by DPU colleagues, past, present, and no doubt in the future. As someone myself currently involved in teaching at the DPU, strategic action planning not only provides a big part of the framework underpinning the department's ambition to reclaim and hold this transformative potential of planning, and in so doing nurture new generations of strategic action planners, but it also offers us a route into understanding 70 years, and that's why we're here celebrating today as well, 70 years of collective building in this direction. As just one example, by Caren placing the durable expansion of a room for manoeuvre at the heart of what it means to be strategic. Caren not only evolved earlier DPU contributions around collective action planning, she also connected up significant DPU contributions by thinkers and doers, such as the sadly missed Michael Safier. Of course, there's a lot more to say here, but with an eye on time, I feel that this nod to Caren's commitment to always expanding the space available to progressive urban actors is a perfect place to hand over to Alex. But just one more thing I have to do, and maybe we can flip now to the final slide. In honour of tonight, I worked with Otoya to do a bit of a glow-up on your strategic action planning diagram. We can bring in the arrow now. I think there's a second animation. I think this maybe can be something to take forward away from tonight.
You're going in this ground.
Yeah, I know.
That was very brave. Very brave. Okay. I'm not going to try to redo any of your diagrams, Caren. Don't worry. Don't get nervous. So yeah, thanks for the invitation, for being here with you, to be able to share some thoughts and some reflections about this theme. As some of you know in the room, I have worked very closely with Caren for 15 years. And I wanted also, similar to Julian, I wanted to discuss this connection between the thinking, the teaching, and the practice, this interconnection about Caren. She didn't just talk and write about strategic action planning, but she applied it, she practiced it within the institutions that she lived. I can see Alan shaking his head there, and the institutions with whom she has engaged with, not only within but also outside. Driven by a strong, explicit, and non-negotiable set of social justice values, I think similarly as Julian was pointing out, Caren constantly strives to create conditions for transformative action. to create those conditions so that actually action can emerge, that many of us here have enacted and played our role in utilizing those spaces and those conditions. She looks for the cracks and finds entry points for action. Sometimes she creates the cracks. I've been in board meetings with Caren where conversations go slightly in the wrong direction, I would say away from social justice, let's put it that way, and she masterfully reframes the whole discussion and brings it back to a social justice orientation without anybody kind of disagreeing with her and somehow everybody agreeing that that was where they were going in the first place. Above all, Caren is a person of action, collective action. She builds collective intent with people around her, including colleagues, research partners, students, communities. Caren brings the big picture, always with history on her side, and never a pessimist. Caren never flattens history, but also does not get paralyzed by it. I would advise you, some of you have done this, but to drive through Cape Town with Caren. It's a fantastic experience that just shows the power of building collective intent by looking backward and looking forward. Actually, if you allow Caren, if we allowed her, every event she ever organized would be called gender justice, looking back, looking forward. Urban equality, looking back, looking forward. It was, I think, the theme of the celebration of the 60 years of the DPU, looking back and looking forward, and here we are, still looking back and looking forward. Caren is also a person of practice. When she sees an opportunity for setting precedents, she sees it, promoting and supporting it. Sometimes we are part of some sort of precedent setting, even if we don't fully understand. But we know that Caren does. She understands, or at least we hope she does. Maybe she makes us think that she does. Regardless, it's clear that the precedents we're involved in with Caren's guidance aren't ends in themselves, but rather means to expand the room for maneuver. Precedents unlock the trigger pathways to do things that were not possible before or to do them differently. Caren used all of these ammunitions, all those different devices of strategic action planning to build a 5-year research project called Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality. This massive research project involved 13 institutions, some of them represented in the room here with us, across 9 different cities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It ran from 2017 to 2022, building on a long-term set of collaborations that the DPU had with IIHS, with the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, with the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center, and many others. Caren worked with different teams to develop knowledge co-production initiatives that could not only study, but actually advance urban equality. Our annual project meetings were incredible, far from a very typical research projects. I'm remembering Bangalore, I'm remembering Havana when we were all together there. They focused on the political project each team was pursuing, the pathways they were building, and the challenges, obstacles, and tactics that they were deploying to make things happen. They were finding cracks, they were building collective intent, they were setting precedents, they were expanding the room for maneuver. Noah is a good example of the type of scaffolding Caren has built throughout her career, strengthening the conditions to generate a multiplying effect of both local and international actions. One example of the kind of international action enabled by NO was the partnership with United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, which resulted in the development of the Gold 6 report called Pathways for Urban and Territorial Equality. This was a massive 2-year endeavor, drawing on NO's content, but also on NO's ways of working. The result set the precedent in UCLG for a more collaborative and strategic approach of producing global reports, which we can still see today how structural the GOLD process was in UCLG's ways of working. So strategic action planning is about making change happen, and if you need any evidence that it works, just look around you and see how many people here have been impacted by Caren's thinking and practice. Thank you, Caren.
So then we move on to the third thematic that that we ask two speakers to join us tonight. Professor Julia Davila, Professor of Urban Policy and International Development, and Daniel Oviedo, Associate Professor at DPU, who will reflect on transport justice team.
Unlike Tim, I didn't realize we had to be serious, so I'm not going to be serious. But what I'm going to do is reflect on a long friendship and long collaboration with Caren. And I'm going to take you to the field, because this is an area that, I mean, we've seen Caren as the intellectual, drawing these wonderful graphs and teaching and so on, and we see a lot of that. But I want to take you on a field trip with her. This is the field trip from a long project that I was PI of. And Caren had the enormous pleasure of working with Caren in that project. And I had the enormous pleasure of also meeting Danielle as a research assistant then. So, a friendship that evolved, and we discovered transport as an area of not only endeavour and intervention, but also of daily life in cities, which DPU hadn't, until Harry left, hadn't actually worked on in any seriousness. I mean, Harry, who's here, worked on it, 20 years before we did this work. And this is a reflection of how people live, putting very much social justice at the centre of it. And working with Caren was actually constantly reminding us to put these important values at the forefront. So you can actually picture Bogota. Bogota has pretty much the same population as London, but look what space it takes. It's much denser. London is very, very low density. But this is the kind of density you see. This area here is around here. So this is an area, a municipality called Soacha, which is about 1 million people today. I started visiting Soacha in my undergraduate degrees a long time ago. I kept going back to it, and you see this is pretty much the same angle that I took. So for me, working in this area was actually like going back to a place that I knew and had evolved. And for those of you who are not familiar with Latin American cities, this is how a lot of people live, right? They live in areas like this with informality, at high density. This is sort of new private sector development. But largely, these are areas where we've studied, and we've been studying them for a long time. And you can see in this area, which is called Casuca and Ciudad Sucre, you can see all the signs of informality: unpaved roads, precarious land titles, self-help housing, high share of tenancies, teenage pregnancies, all these things, and self-help signs, signs of people self-building, and things like this guy who does electricity, metal decoration, and bikes. So there's no labor specialization, which is typical of the informal sector. Now there we were as researchers, looking around, and it was quite spooky. I mean, for Caren, as I said, Caren grew up in Cape Town, so she saw things like this. I grew up in Bogota, and there was a lot of. Oops, where is it?
It's there. It's hanging in your back.
My tail between the legs. And we have lots in common. And I've always wanted to take Caren to Bogota and to Colombia, and I finally managed to do it with Nick Tyler, who I don't think is here. I don't see Nick today. And actually, this is a spooky place because it's a place of heavy violence. And we were actually, especially Caren, I think, because this is a kind of violence that Caren wasn't used to observing. This is a different kind of violence. It was a little spooky. But the other thing is note how some people are not wearing hats. And this is 2,600 meters above sea level with it. It feels as chilly as it is, but the sun really hits you, right? Finally, we were able to find a place where we could go to Lou and buy some delicious bread. But thankfully, somebody lent Caren a umbrella. Despite which, you ended up with sunstroke at the end of the day, because it was, it is one of these experiences that, if you don't know the environment, you actually can actually suffer a lot. Then the next thing was the main city that we were studying, which was Medellin. And this is, again, the cable cars, thing that I started looking at for a long time. And then again, I took Caren and the whole team to several visits to Medellin, including some of my colleagues for one of the WOOF meetings. And there we went on focus group discussions, we went on walks with lovely people. Of course, we rode the cable car, And of course, there was always the practical issues of being in the field and looking for places where we can actually go to the loo and also eat. But at the end of the day, there was always a space for celebration. And actually, the biggest pizza I've ever seen in my life. We were also sharing a lovely flat owned by the University Professors Union, which means that about 10 of us were actually sharing a space for about a week, which was actually fantastic. It was one of the most lovely experiences we had. We also looked at another case study within the city, which is the other set of comunas with very different problems, but also again marked by violence. But what was interesting, what we're looking at is how effective can local government be in terms of interventions, not only around transport, which is what interested us, but also upgrading and different kinds of things. We were taken on tours. It was actually wonderful to see that and be taken by the commitment and the degree of interest and knowledge that the people like the chief architect of the city and the chief engineer in the metro station, in the metro company, who is now the director, has been for about 5 or 6 years, but also talking to sort of locals and so on. Again, the threat of violence in a city like Colombia is never too far. So it's one of these things where you need your wits around, and I think Caren did extremely well, even finding nice places to sit and relax at some point. So after 3 years of very intense work, we produced a number of outputs. Some of them are here. Caren there with the legendary Professor Gackenheimer, who sadly passed away last year, and some of our former students. So we had a fabulous, fabulous time. But I think probably my greatest delight was Caren went back to coffee. And after 20 years of not drinking coffee, she took a sip in the university. I remember it very distinctly, and she said, "This is really nice." And she was hooked. And she's now hooked to Colombian coffee. But also the other thing that we had in common was the fruits. And Caren calls it Cape gooseberries. They're not. These things are called uchulas. And we'll have this dispute forever. Anyway, thank you for that.
Right, so 2 reasons why it's hard to follow up on that is that, one, I had to take it seriously because he didn't. And the second really is because by taking it seriously, I've gone with a different perspective. So I tried to call it, the second reason is because we didn't actually talk about transport. If you realize the whole presentation wasn't anything about transport. It was, but it had a point. It had a very important point, and it's that with Caren, we learned about how to address transport in the field and in the classroom. And for me, and I have to thank Julio, because he didn't make Caren my PhD supervisor when I came. So when they snatched me from Bogota and they brought me here, on that trip to Kazuka, I fell in love with a different way of seeing transport. And that was since the book. But the point here to say that in the classroom with Caren is not only because Caren did something that, again, as Julio was saying, since Harry left, wasn't happening at the DPU for many, many years, which was bringing back a module on transport. But it was a different module on transport. And then, by not having her as my supervisor, I gained a friend and a mentor. And I'm very proud that every moment that I've spent with you, I'm learning something. And I call it the classroom with Caren because although this wasn't part of our module, this is a room full of transport planners and engineers, of which most of are men. And they were all, and they have always been, entranced by Caren's arguments around transport equity and urban mobility. And what it means to approach differently the ways in which we can understand the city. So, in teaching that module, which helped me see things differently, and you have done something fantastic, because in your thinking leadership around transport, you took 2 Colombian engineers, 2 men Colombian engineers, trained in the same school, with the same traditions, And well, we have some other similarities. I'm not going to And you help us creating an agenda on equity and inclusion that today I'm happy to say that has flourished into 9 women and Orlando working on transport at the DPU. So, with that, you've taught us to look at transport as something political, at transport as something practical that depends not only from what the state does and where resources come and where policies are made, but what happens with that informal sector that Holly was talking about. And the most important part is that you never stop looking at it from the perspective of gender, of power relations, and of the structural drivers that put us in a different position to deal with our daily challenges for urban mobility. And on that, and I wanted to use a photo of you with your diagram, but unfortunately Alex wasn't available in our last dialogue in development, and every photo was out of focus. So I couldn't. So I went back to the TISUM project, which was another of Karen's huge achievements, because yes, I, of course, as everyone else, acknowledge the power of now. And I actually was, for reasons out of my control, the first project manager of No, and I put Aro on a very uncomfortable flight, and I put Brahma from Slord to do 36 hours of connections just to save a few pounds. That, and you cannot imagine the earful that I got after that, but you learn. That's why it's a classroom. It's always a classroom. But in the other GCR project that we got, which was TISUM, which was also led by engineers, and engineers who didn't necessarily were thinking about equity, we're not thinking about the transition, the technological transition to urban mobility. Karen brought something that spoke to justice, that spoke to recognition, that spoke to political participation, and that made not only the research that we did and the way that we were teaching our transport module a way of inclusively thinking about mobility as a way of transforming our cities and as a point of participation, reflection, and debate. I want to close with this one because, and here, Nick is here. Nick is everywhere, even if it's in spirit. I want to close with this one because this is the same group of engineers, many of whom travel from all over the place, including our partners in Maputo and in Freetown. And I really thought about that photo because I hate how I look. But that was not about me, it was about you, and you look great. So that's why the photo is there. But after that conversation, we managed to do something that for me was quite astonishing. And it was creating a partnership in which, from the ministry to the mayor, because we actually managed to get the mayor here, to the same engineers, to the practitioners, to the representatives of the World Bank, we were talking about, in equal footing, about the social implications of transport, the distributional implications of transport, and how to look back and look forward. Thank you, Tim, because that's true. That's always been present in Karen's work. And to imagine a different type of mobility. So with this, I want to close with a homage to your quote about redefining mobility as a right to move in public space with safety and security and without censure and social control. And I'm looking forward to write all the papers that you owe me in co-authorship.
And finally, our last theme to discuss, I'm going to introduce Barbara Lipietz, who again doesn't need that much introduction, Professor of Urban Development Planning at DPU and the current Bartlett Weinstein International, and Aro Makarere, who has traveled all the way from India, and we are delighted to have Aro here with us. Aro is the director of the Indian Institute of Human Settlement, IIHS, who is another close friend and ally of Karen. Both have worked hard over the years to offer us new ways of thinking about knowledge creation and co-production in the field of development planning, the planning higher education and capacity building.
Thank you very much, Azadeh, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I think, Caren, have you heard enough? Nothing said about you, but no, not quite, because it's going to continue. And I think what we're doing right now is just to bring yet another dimensions of the many contributions that Caren has brought to the field of planning, gender, transport planning, etc. And that is very much it's her approach, really, her approach to knowledge production, which is really at the base of all of our work. And I'm going to do this quite briefly because I would like to let my colleague Arrow speak a little bit more, not only because he's arrived from Bangalore, which is a long way away, and he deserves to have more place, but actually Arrow has been working for a very long time with Caren, and I think also it befits this particular section here to give more space to Arrow, I think. So what I really wanted to mention is that in the previous inputs have all highlighted, of course, the complexity of Caren's action-oriented works towards transformative practice. Much of this work around gender justice, strategic action planning, transport justice, is underpinned by a particular reframing of the knowledge base that can inform decision-making and plan-making, both in terms of how we get to know the concrete, real needs, demand, aspiration of people, but also, of course, how and what we know about the political opportunity structure, or what Caren would say, the room for maneuver, for doing things differently. And Caren's contribution to the debate of knowledge at the heart of planning is that transformatory knowledge is fundamentally plural, that many actors are key in this production of knowledge, and that those often deemed unknowing, slum dwellers, waste pickers, informal traders, etc., are in fact particularly knowing. And what derives from this reframed assumption is that knowledge that counts has to be co-created, has to be co-produced in partnerships beyond the traditional holders of expertise, the professionals, the private sector, indeed the state. And we're not just talking about any partnership either, we're talking about partnerships with equivalence, which is a term that she coined, that is partnerships that are based on mutual respect, an ethics of engagement, a genuine attentiveness to really listening to and engaging with each other's input and co-constructing, therefore, something different, a different solution that come out of it, despite, in spite, and through all our differences. So Caren does this by applying this approach to the process of knowledge creation at the heart of the official knowledge-making machine that is universities, and that's what I want to talk about very briefly here. So the home of theory building, the home of shaping future practitioners, the home of expertise. Actually, Caren says, no. This is actually a space that needs to be co-created. And she does that not just in her classroom, not only in her writing, but she actually does something quite special, which is really to challenge and encourage others around her to rethink the way universities need to project themselves and need to think about knowledge production. So she does that with her appointment as the first Vice Dean International of the Bartlett, under the leadership of Professor Alan Penn, who is here in this room. I'm not quite sure if he fully knew what he was getting when he got Caren on board in this position, but Caren comes in. And I don't know whether if there was much competition for that job, but clearly she impressed, and of course she would. And then she does things and takes them in her subtle but very determined way to change the ways in which principles of international engagement are developed within the Bartlett. And core to this, of course, is this idea of partnerships with equivalence. But it's something very profound. You know, we're talking about the Bartlett here, the #1 faculty in the world, located in the global north with a very long history. And she gently but firmly suggests and gets written out and published that actually knowledge of the Bartlett is not just one that gets picked up in the field and reworked through frames that have been developed in the global north, but actually she said, this is not the way to do it, really. We have a lot to learn from elsewhere. Creativity is happening elsewhere. And she does this act of decolonization without calling it decolonization, because it's probably much more subtle and much more profound to get people to accept change in that way. And she does that in the way in which knowledge is produced, but also, of course, in the way in which we think about our students and their contribution also to knowledge creation. So Caren does this, and I'm not going to be long because I know Ari is going to tell us how she does this at multiple international scale. But I think it's important for all of you who don't know that not only does she profoundly transforms the way in which the Bartlett can start to talk about its international engagement, but her ideas are so compelling and so forceful, in a gentle way, but determined way, that they get taken up also by the Vice Provost of International Engagement at the time, Dame Nicola Brewer, who couldn't make it tonight, but who wanted to send a few words also, which I'm going to read. So Caren and her international work at the Bartlett played such an important part in framing the whole of the first global engagement strategy of UCL. She was a real ally and such a supportive, encouraging and like-minded colleague, especially when I first joined UCL. Please give her my warmest, best wishes for the future and huge thanks for the international contributions she made at and for UCL. So this is Caren's contribution to the Bartlett and UCL, and I'm now going to pass on to Ari.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here. For many reasons, I'm like the bag penny that lands up at DPU at the best of times and the worst of times. The last was at DPU60, and we're at 70 already. But it's a pleasure being here. Like I was telling Julio, these days, because I have to travel a lot, there are only two reasons that I travel. One is because there's something really important happening, or the second thing is because of friends' calls. And this, like he said, is exactly both those things together. So it's been a pleasure working with Caren for a really long time. And while we are seeing all these wonderful photographs, if you can put up the diagram, I'll tell you, some stories about how it plays itself out and how it works. See, one of the interesting things about great universities is they give ordinary people like us the opportunities, in some senses, sometimes, to actually not only change the university and our students, but actually change the world. And part of what I think Caren has been doing for many, many years is now, and in a sense what DPU has done for many years, is bringing people from across the world, allowing them to see things differently. We heard about the transpiration example, we heard about many other examples. And then reflect that back in their own context. And that is a rare thing. And especially in Caren's case, I think the important connection, like many of us share in IIHS, is a connection between the practice and the real change in the world, which Samsuk spoke about, the research, which then looks at that critically, right? And then bringing that back into the teaching learning environment to actually generate and create an entirely new set of academics and practitioners who can go out and do many things that you as an individual, whether you're in South Africa or in India or Colombia or Brazil or even in the UK for that matter, UK needs a lot of help these days, can actually go out and make a change. So I think that's a remarkable process, and the fact that UCL and DPU have created and enabled people to make this happen is really important. But in some senses, one of the reasons I made the journey all the way from Bangalore is because in some ways we're giving back to you, because the DPU, if you go back into some amount of history, was where Otto actually found himself. And in many ways, Caren is probably the last person of that generation who's coming through the academic program. And Otto was very important, not only to India, but also to the process of making this happen. So in some senses, the building that he built, which they never put his name on, because he actually designed the municipal sort of hall in Bangalore, because it was just during the war, the colonials didn't allow him, because he was interned, to put his name in there as the architect. It's just been refurbished just now. So it's a wonderful cycle in some sense. But anyway, can I have the diagram, not this? This is just a logo, the one that we went up in the beginning. Okay. So while that's coming up, I'll tell a quick story of something that was a little naughty that we did many, many years ago. In 2009, I came to DPU in search of partners to help us try and build this somewhat heterodox university that's now 15 years later almost about to happen. And I came and had a chat with various colleagues here. No, not this one. The big no one. This is all the web stuff. No. They're not. The first one, the first slide that we put up. So
the framework.
No framework. Yeah.
The framework.
Yes, the framework. Sorry.
I'll get my slide.
Okay. Yes, the first one. Anyway, we'll come to that later. So I came in and said, look, I managed to persuade in one of the American foundations to share $1 million now. Unfortunately, to help us set this university up, to build this frame of how we would try and create it. Okay, come back to this. So, I'm talking about these three things here. We're talking about co-learning and co-production. I'm talking here about planning higher education. So the question that we had was, how can we build a heterodox, not a center, not a department, but a university that's focusing on urban questions, because the single largest urbanization after China is going to happen in our place. This is 2009. I said, look, we managed to persuade, a fairly rich American foundation to give us $1 million. MIT, unfortunately, have finished 2/3 of it. Can you manage with the other third and bring the rest of the world outside North America to try and have a conversation with us? So there were two parts of that process. One, bringing Caren into this wonderful meeting at MIT with kind of all the greats of American urban higher education there. Maybe 80 years of deans, etc., etc., etc. And the first morning was spent. It's very interesting for us. The Americans are actually discovering that across the pond, so to speak, they had the same problems as far as urban development is concerned. And Caren was going on about how planning here had all the challenges that the Americans had. And they said, "Oh my God, I wish we had actually shared the same journals, because then American planning theory would actually be quite different." So anyway, it started like that, but I think what we've been able to do together in that is to answer a very, very critical question that we're still trying to play out, and that was, what was it that a young person needs to know to help transform our part of the world, which is 1/6 of humanity, 500 million people, and I think that engagement that Caren kind of led within the DPU and otherwise was a phenomenal contribution, not only to us, but I think the construction of how organization can be looked at as an organizing principle bring 30 disciplines together. So, many thanks. We have a great sort of bond of gratitude to DPU and all the other colleagues, because the interesting thing that happened to us is it was not a conversation with one university in a global north city. It was actually a conversation with colleagues from Latin America, from Africa. IIHS now works extensively in Africa, and that happened because people from France, because the French actually, after 68 and so on, they built this and they broke down the whole program. They built a completely new framework, which is actually quite useful. So DPU anchored a multinational engagement for us, which then opened us up to non-Anglo-Saxon ways of looking at the world, which would not have happened in other places, right? Which is very different from my engagement with people in North America. So I think that was a very important part of it. And then many years later, my colleagues who were part of this process, at that time very young, right, were mentored here. So many thanks from many of them. You've seen their photographs up there, Neha and Kavita and Amlan and Gautam, etc., who have come through here and who actually formed the backbone of the institution that's about, hopefully, in the next few months, becoming a university. Because they came and spent time here, and Caren and many of you here created a space for them to spend, many weeks and months to reflect on what they were doing and build the foundations, which is the second thing we're talking about here. Building capacity, not only about communities and engineers and all kinds of odd places, but building the capacity of people who are trying to build new institutions and doing that in a deep and compassionate and open way. That, I think, was a tremendous contribution. And in some ways, we will hopefully give back to the world in the way that you've given to us in other things. And then finally, we spent many years together, and you saw all the photographs and Havana and other stuff like that, building the framework around NO. And NO was a very special program. At least for me, I worked in maybe 60 odd countries. But it was very, very special because it brought together communities of practice from, 90 different institutions or whatever it is of that kind, to try and reflect on how you can integrate all the stuff that you've done, starting with the battles around gender justice, into a whole range of other processes in cultural context. And that process, in a sense, is to me a example of how you can build not only partnerships of equivalence, but you can actually build cross-national solidarity. Because what we need in a very fractured world that we are in today is not only doing things in our own context, but also doing it across contexts. For us to be able to spend time to understand what Cuba actually has managed to do in 40 years was a transformative experience of how we could think about urbanization, about pedagogy, about a whole range of other processes. For them to come and spend time with us, of course, was a mind-blowing experience. Bangalore is a pretty small city, etc., etc., etc. So I think the ability to create the spaces that Caren has done has been really remarkable in some ways. So all these things are not theory. This is what we did. We are now, like I said, we built hopefully one of the most interesting institutions working on urban questions in the world. The capacity of most of my colleagues was built through these dialogues with many of you here, and then the grounding in research, because Caren is on our International Advisory Council. The prodding that happens once or twice a year, saying, what are you chaps actually doing? Because the wonderful thing about her is not only the caring and the compassion, which is absolutely central to actually being, I think, a living practitioner. It is, I would not tolerate any bullshit. So I'll stop there, and it's been a pleasure being here. And like Santok said, you're going to have a not very happy retirement.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Now, Caren, I want to ask you again if you want to come in with any at the end. Okay. So then we can open the discussion, and both online and those of you in the room. If you have any comments, any questions for Caren, please. You are the first one.
My voice is loud enough, so I don't. Sorry. As Daniel said, he got to have Caren as a mentor and a friend. I had the incredible privilege and honor to have her as my PhD supervisor. And I have a little story about. We get two for the price of one. When I joined the DPU, Julio was just taking over. I saw Caren pass the baton to Julio, director, in 2012, and then she disappeared. So for the first year, I had Caren as supervisor in absentia. And the wonderful Colin, who was my second supervisor, stepped up and was my primary supervisor. And Caren, of course, was this legend, right? So I've kind of seen her, but I've never really met her. She's disappeared. And, sort of as we get towards the end of the year, we know that Karen's coming back. And, every time I say, oh, Karen's coming back, oh, Caren. Karen's supervisor, okay. So it's like, I'm terrified because I've never met this person. She's going to be supervising me. I've been dealing with Colin, who's lovely, and I'm just this superstar's going to come back and then look at my work and say, who is this person? Towards the end, so I'm kind of half hoping that, the arrangement will stay, Caren will come back, but I'll, be with Colin. And then, somewhere along the line, Colin comes to me and says, Caren wants you. At that point. And it is to my lasting, it has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life to be supervised by Caren. The DPU has been a wonderful home for me. And Caren, I was actually with UKNA, I got to spend a little bit of time with IIHS. I feel like I've been a part of DPU history. I don't know what I did to deserve Caren as my supervisor, but what I will say is that she was the most generous and the most, I think you said it perfectly. There was the generosity there, but also no bullshit. So, you know, her comments were very generous, but very clearly, this needs to improve. So, thank you so much, Caren. I can never repay all that you've done for me. Thank you.
So I'm Alan. I took over as Dean in 2009. Caren, of course, was already in place. Just a short story here. I was told when I took this on, the DPU, you know, there's an issue here. It's not part of UCL proper. It doesn't sit inside the UCL financial system. And as a dean, that's all you're in charge of, is the financial system. So your job is to bring it in. So I met with Caren, and you know, it was, she had obviously been in place for a while already, and she was well attuned to the pressures that are put on you. And we had a long discussion, and in that discussion we sort of said, well look, there appears to be this move towards centralisation of the financial system. She said, that's terrible, we have a very efficient system, we send out the bills to the students pay the money, it goes into the bank account, we pay the salaries, it cuts out all of the overhead that the university imposes. And you know what, she's absolutely right. However, it was quite clear that we had to make a move. Now, little did I suspect that in bringing the DPU into UCL's full financial system, what would then transpire? So a couple of years later, it became clear UCL was going to be London's global university. And so we created the idea of having a vice dean international. And Caren was persuaded to take on this job, and she actually was rather slow at producing a strategy. Barbara's already talked about this, but she produced a strategy. And then a year later, Nicola Brewer arrived as the Vice Provost International, coming also from Cape Town, actually. It's an interesting wrinkle here. But she was completely won over by Karen's strategy, and then plagiarised it. Which, of course, is by far the best form of compliment. And what I realised afterwards was that what Caren was doing, she was mainstreaming the DPU philosophy and ethos into UCL. So UCL thought that it had brought the DPU into its financial system and this would be very beneficial, but in fact, what had happened was the DPU ethos then pervaded the rest of the university. And this was obviously Caren's masterplan.
Contagious. Thank you very much, Azerbaijan. Caren, I never had this opportunity to publicly thank you for all your support 12 years ago when I had the crazy idea to having an international conference at UCL for a country that was under sanction, that even the embassy was closed back then, Iran. And when Julio and Cassidy, Michael suggested that I need to talk with the director of DPU, that was terrifying. But when you asked me, Farnell, who are you presenting, you know, and took the answer that I'm presenting people like me, those underrepresented practitioners in developing countries who don't have a voice in the global knowledge system, and the trust that you put on the vision, which still continues. You know, I always, you know, Julio is there, Michael is there, Cassidy is there, but I never had the chance to publicly thank you for the very impactful support that you all had for us, basically. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I was also supervised by Caren. I was also intrigued of where she was the first year because I studied the same years as nature. And it was more about the end of the PhD when, well, first of all, it's very difficult to have time to see Caren, but when she sees you, even if it's 5 minutes, whatever she says, it's like magic. You're like, wow. But at the end, when I had to pick my examiners for my viva, I thought that one would pick them, or we would pick them with Alex, that was my first supervisor, but no, Caren has her plans, so you just follow them. And she suggested Caroline Moser, who I think is here. Caroline was Karen's mentor. So that was terrifying to me. But it meant that maybe something was going to be okay. So that was a very nice experience in the Viva to have Caren Moser as well. And everyone says when you join DPU that you never leave DPU. And actually I was in DPU for 10 years and it was quite difficult to leave DPU. But now I work in UN Women and I just drafted the strategy for ending violence against women and girls in humanitarian crisis. And my first two references in the strategy are Caren and Caroline Moser.
Thank you. I also wanted to publicly thank Caren for all her help and support and everything over the years. And I think for me it came at the moment in which I came to work at the DPU and it was my first job as a lecturer. And I feel that Caren taught me a lot about teaching and perhaps everything I know about teaching was taught to me by Caren. Well, maybe not everything, obviously, but some of the most important things about how to interact with the class, how to teach from a place of heart, from a place in which you believe about the things you are saying, from a place in which you are looking at the importance of the things, rather than just where I was coming from, I guess, which was like, oh, this literature, we have to do all this. But no, what is it, the key message, the key thing? And what are even the ethics in our teaching? What is the kind of the ultimate normative complement of that? And I've always really remembered that. I've always remembered how important teaching was for me, and I think probably this is something that I'll always be coming back to. Thank you, Caren, for that.
I'd also like to thank Caren. I'm Jen, I'm in the Butler School of Architecture. And I guess first got to know Caren as a sort of feminist friend in the faculty, particularly when we were both vice deans at the same time. But then I really want to thank Caren for inviting me into the DPU as part of the amazing No project. I think people who've seen the photographs up there must feel very jealous if they weren't involved. It was a pretty incredible experience. And I think through that experience, not only learning about development planning and the institutionalising web, we had another version of that, I think, at one of our first No meetings, but really thinking about just learning from Caren about how you could manage a project of that scale across that many countries and institutions and people, and somehow keep the humanity together and keep the vision of the project intact while actually listening to this diversity of voices and positions and keeping the humour alive, I think. There was always humour and lots of fun times together. But I would definitely agree with Aaron that alongside the care and the compassion, and also the cleverness, I think, with which Caren takes these insurmountable problems that you think could never be addressed, but manages to do it in this very, very subtle way. I'm really, really impressed by that. But definitely this quality of no bullshit. I think that was really, for me, so important, that it's not just an endless compassion, there's a line always, like, as far as this, and then this is maybe not where we go. So I just think Karen's, I just learned so much from her leadership of the No Project, and from being able to be friends with so many amazing people in this room, and get to know the work that DPU does, and the relationships with the Global South institutions and partners, which has completely transformed the way that I do my own research. So thank you, Caren.
Okay, so let's see if there are any other hands coming up. Otherwise, I'm going to pass to Caren to close the event, but don't leave. We are not going to stop celebrating here. We are going to continue our celebration to UCL South Cloisters. So stay with us and join us for drinks and nibbles later. But I'm going to hand in to Caren.
Thank you all so much. I really am a bit overwhelmed by everything, and I feel, without making it sound like a cliche, I really feel 1,000 times blessed by everybody. Really, it's just wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate this. As Azadeh said, we are celebrating DPU70 this year, and it was my great pleasure to put together with Albert and with Ottavia Pasta, who did a fantastic job in the layout and the production, to update the last decade of the DPU. In fact, I also updated from 50 to 60, and I was now updating from 60 to 70, and actually it's just come out, so you can grab a copy of it later. But it was an amazing experience, as it always is, to do something like that, because it gives you a kind of overview of what you and your colleagues have achieved in a period of time. And as I was doing it, of course, in this 2024, in the year when I finally decided to step down, I couldn't help reflecting on the history and thinking how extraordinary. I've been part of this history for 40 years. It's quite amazing, really. And I couldn't help also think how lucky I was as a young person to land in the DPU. I did land here. Actually, I came to the DPU largely to be with John Turner, who was running a course on housing. And that was actually in 1994. I started working formally in 86, but I came, to meet with John and talk to him, and John said, well, we need someone to help, run the courses. And John was a giant in our field, and it was such an honor to meet him and to talk to him and then to listen to him teach. And well, so of course the question I often ask myself is, how did the DPU hold me here for 40 years? And I think it did so because it was a place I could grow and flourish in, actually. It's a place where we, as I think so many of you spoke about this evening, where we shared a common vision about a much better world. about a socially just and sustainable world. And what was informative in my development was that commitment that DPU always had from the very beginning to the active engagement of communities in policy and planning. And it was also DPU's engagement with practice that, as so many of you have talked about, that kind of drew me in, and it challenged me throughout all the time, and it took me on multiple journeys and circuitous journeys often, of working from practice to methodology to theory to pedagogy, and then back to practice and to theory and to methodology. And it was just such a wonderful, wonderful journey, and something that I felt alive about every minute that I worked on these issues. And I think what's clear to me today, and I feel so much, without getting too sentimental, I feel so much love in the room. It wouldn't be possible to talk about the DPU without talking about my peers and and the partners that I've worked with over the years. I've had the pleasure to engage with extraordinary people. And in the UK, of course, within the DPU, we have all sorts of groups where we work together, our UDP group, our gender policy and planning group, and of course all our research clusters. And these are just wonderful spaces where I've just learned so much. And with my colleagues, I think what has been extraordinary, I guess because I've been around so long, this kind of cross-generational learning that I experienced, to learn from the colleagues when I came in. My very, very first trip abroad was to Sri Lanka, to the Million Houses program with Pat and Baba, and I learned so much about the field, about being in a place, and about looking at a place and understanding it, and it never stopped from there. It just went on, and that cross-generational learning isn't just about learning from the older generation. It was also learning from the younger generation. I think learning from students and from my PhD students just was a joy throughout. And I would also like to say at this point that in the DPU, we also have this wonderful engagement between our academic staff and our professional staff. And that's something I treasure always. I know most of you sitting back there. What a team. What a team we are. Really. I can't tell you. There's no way I could have done many of the things without your support, and I'll be eternally grateful for that. And I think, of course, of my colleagues in the Bartlett, Alan was, for me, also a baptism of fire to lead the DPU, and having you as the dean of our faculty at that time was so important. I always thank you for that support, really. It was fantastic. And my colleagues in UCL, there are a few here, I often think about, we had such an extraordinary group across UCL, SOAS, across what was then the Institute of Education, when we formed the Bloomsbury Gender Network, and we did some extraordinary things together over a number of years. That was extremely special. And partners in other UK universities, and of course my partners abroad that worked within universities, in NGOs, in CBOs, were just so crucial to my learning, and I'm just so touched by Sum Suk's message, because she is just the most inspirational thinker, who probably had she did have a real impact on the way I thought about strategic action planning. I don't know if Sum Suk has a middle name, but it should be strategic. If she does. And I'd also, you know, there were so many others. I don't want to mention names because I know I'll forget people. But really, there's so many people that I learned from the ground that I'm eternally grateful for in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, and the Middle East. And so, really, this environment of the DPU has been so supportive, nurturing, exciting, and so generating in so many ways, so positive that it's really amazing to think of, that I was lucky enough to have 40 years here. And I know, again, it might be a cliche to thank one's families on such occasions, but there's a good reason, I guess, that one does when you have such an occasion. I know there are those of you in this audience and there are people online who know my family because you've met them over the years, you've spent time with them. And I really couldn't have done what I did without their support and nourishment. They nourished me as a person throughout, and they've celebrated all the key milestones with me. And I just also want to thank them publicly so much. Finally, I'd just like to thank everybody for today, to the panelists who were so generous. And your words were so precious, and I really appreciate that. And a special thanks to Aro and Claudie from traveling to be with me today. It's really special to have you here. Azadeh, I want to thank you not just for chairing this evening, but really to thank you for taking the lead of the organization of this event in such a wonderful manner. And I can't tell you how special that is to me. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for coming this evening, and for those, for everybody online too, some of whom I know who are online because they said they would be online. And I'd like to thank you all. It's been so overwhelming, and I will treasure the memory of this event. And Alex, I'm hoping that we'll be able to see some of it online, which will be fantastic. So can I just probably end in a way that I hadn't scripted to end, but I've somehow been forced to do that in the situation, is thank you so much for joining me, looking back.